All right, good morning, Dr. Jackson. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the PRBA, your role in the PRBA, some of the training activities of the PRBA, and what you think is unique today about the PRBA and what the future of the PRBA might be. So let's just kind of start at the beginning. So in the very early days, how did it all come about? So we know that it didn't really start as the PRBA. It started as the National Survey of Black Americans. So how did that come about? What were the early conversations? And then you can take it from there.
Well, this all has a very complicated beginning. So let me meander a little bit because without being too focused. So some of this has to do with regard to my own personal biography. So which becomes important in interpreting PRBA and how it arrived. By the way, the Program for Research on Black Americans was not the original title of the program. In fact, there were lots of discussions among the group back in the mid-'70s about what the program title should be. In fact, the two things that were at the end was the Program for Research on Black Americans and the Program for Research for Black Americans, and it was a debate. I remember we had a big noon meeting upstairs and had lots of arguments about what the title should be. So it was not simply decided upon. The National Survey on Black Americans was a little easier to do. So back in 1971, when I arrived at the University of Michigan, I'm the only full-time black faculty in the Department of Psychology, and there were 176 people in that department. There were two African-American part-time faculty. One was Ewart Thomas, who was a full-time faculty member in the residential college. Ewart is an outstanding experimental researcher, but they did not give him a full-time appointment in the department. The other was Floyd Wiley, who was a part-time faculty member, taught one course. In fact, he and I taught a course together once I arrived for about 15 years. And Ewart was very important in my own development. After a couple of 3 years, Ewart left to become a assistant professor at Stanford. And as a matter of fact, in the first few years I was here, I almost left for Stanford. Stanford offered me a position in must have been around 78 or so. So I almost left here to go to Stanford in their department. The decision not to go there was really all about the program, the fact that there were many, many black students here. So this department had embarked upon a process of bringing in large numbers of black students, particularly from historically black colleges, and they had no idea what to do with them when they arrived here. And when I say large numbers, I mean large numbers. I think one year early on, they brought in 15 black students, particularly from historically black colleges and so on. And there they were. It was really quite
And
interesting.
you were the only black faculty member?
Full-time.
Full-time.
As I just explained.
Right.
So anyway, Pat Gurin and Jerry Gurin played a very important role in the history of this program. In fact, you can't overstate their particular historical importance in how this program developed in what way. Jerry and Pat were running a very interesting grant that they had at that particular point in time I had to be around 74 or so, somewhere around that notion, in which they had hired large numbers of black graduate students to work with them, and they were doing research in the South. They had opened up all kinds of relationships and liaisons there. But they were having some difficulties in terms of running that particular study. And they asked me to be the study director for that study. I forgot what the name of it was at some point. So I took that task on, and of course that got me then more involved with the graduate students and so on. it was through this kind of involvement with Pat and with the graduate students. PRBA never would have happened without the graduate student involvement. It was all about, in some ways, it was all about the students. My role was actually as a kind of a facilitator of what their particular legitimate interests were. And there were a lot of issues that we faced at that particular problem. Black graduate students who had come to the University of Michigan were very much interested in doing research on race, as they talked about it. I don't think they were really interested in doing research on race. What they were really interested in doing research was on the life and status of African Americans, and that's not necessarily research on race. But that's the kind of research that they were really interested in, and they had lots and lots of different kinds of questions about those particular set of issues in a lot of different kinds of areas as it kind of related to psychology. Now, there were graduate students from other areas too, particularly in the social sciences, so sociology, political science, lots and lots and lots of other people. And those units did not have an overabundance of black faculty either. So it was, and the Jerry and Pat Gurin research was not necessarily a purely psychological focus on work. They understood the importance of social structure, the ways in which structure operated, and so on. In fact, in the social psychology program in general, since it kind of came out of a joint psychology, sociology perspective, this faculty here in general had a much more appreciation for the importance of social structure than was true in a lot of psychology programs across the country, and therefore could appreciate what some of the black students actually had interest in. So it was in that particular work that we started back sometime in the early 70s. I was heavily involved with community psychology at that time. I was teaching one of the core courses in community psychology. Community psychology, as I've argued in some early papers, actually provided some of the basis for the development, again, of the program for research on black Americans, but some of the perspectives and so on came out of the community psychology movement, which was really all about the fact that the community was heavily and should be heavily involved with setting its priorities, and what was the role of the researcher and the faculty member in that particular issue. We had a very interesting set of national debates on that particular issue. It was really kind of interesting. Parallel to all of this, and you have to kind of, again, there was another kind of parallel stream that was operating, and that parallel stream really had to do with the Association of Black Psychologists and the National Student Black Psychological Association, I guess, if I go back. And I became the national chair of that as a graduate student, so I was heavily involved with national issues, the Black Student Psychological Association, which was a pretty militant group back in the day. They saw themselves as being pretty militant. So later on, I became the president of the Association of Black Psychologists 2 years into, I was very young to do that, but it was part of a compromise to bring the Black Student Psychological Association in with the Association of Black Psychologists, because the Association of Black Psychologists was viewed by the students, at least, as being, what's the right word to use, too conservative, really not with it, not activist enough, you know, a whole host of things like that. So there was a split, and so I became the president of that. I sometimes laugh and said, by doing that, of course, I made some permanent enemies for all time. And you know, if I had to do it all over again, I think I might think about it differently. But what was going on at Michigan? Michigan was actually had formed the Black Student Psychological Association prior to, well, they claimed prior to, at least simultaneously with the National Black Student Psychological Association, which was formed actually in California It was our more militant arm. One of the arguments across the whole 70s and into the 80s was which one came first. But since there was more of a concentration of black graduate students at Michigan than at any other institution, they could rightfully claim, that they were there. So of course my coming here, and then having been national chairman, and actually having been at Wayne State University, as in terms of my training, I actually knew a lot of the graduate students and so on before I even got here, because I'd had some experiences with them. Anyway, so here we are, large numbers of black graduate students, very few African American faculty. As I said, I'm the only full-time faculty at that particular point. And some of the people who are, Frank Yates was a senior graduate student at that point. Frank is a senior faculty member now. Would be an interesting person to interview, actually. He had a certain perspective on all of this, but he was here when I got here. Wade Boykins, who's now at Howard, was a graduate student when I first got here, and there were a host of others. In some perspective, it was really a lot of fun, because some of these people were absolutely out of their minds. So it was like, when they took over the president's house, and I had to go bail them out, and it was a whole set of experiences. This was not easy for Pat and Jerry. They had come from a slightly different perspective, and it's the reason why I think they wanted to get me involved in this kind of work. But that wasn't my work. I was trained as an experimental social psychologist. I was very much interested in experimental applications to human social behavior in a more general sort of way, and had actually not done a lot of research on race. And the research that I'd done on race differences early on in my career as a graduate student really focused in on education. I was very much interested in educational differences and racial influences, and had done research when I was in Wade with the Education Board in Detroit, and had done quite a bit of work in that area. I also had a master's degree in biological psychology. I used to run rats, and had a good time with that. And I started my undergraduate career at Michigan State in '62 in electrical engineering. I was very much interested in science and biology and all the rest of that. And so I came to psychology with that particular perspective. That wasn't the interest of the black graduate students back in the early '70s. Very few of them had these kinds of interests. They were very much interested in exploring, issues that have affected the community in very significant ways. So one of the more controversial issues. So Jerry and Pat were liberal. Were committed to trying to be an effective force with regard to the training of African American students. I was coming out of a training model developed by the Black Student Psychological Association, Association of Black Psychologists. So we made a good pairing. There were many other faculty members here who were supportive. Dan Katz was one. Bob Zients was incredibly supportive. In fact, may have been the most supportive, although students didn't know this, may have been the most supportive of the white faculty, and others too as well. Joe Veroff, Libby Devon, So there were a lot of people who were kind of supportive, broadly speaking, but were clueless with regard to how this should get affected in any particular sort of way. So I took over this project director. By the way, Phil Bowman was here too when I first came. And a lot of these students then gravitated to me, and I began to chair committees. Actually, by '72, I'm chairing committees. And, 200 committees later, or whatever the number would be. It was really quite interesting. Anyway, so we were running this project for Jerry, and it actually involved lots of individual projects, where individual students were running projects, both, and a lot of it having to do with some of Pat and Jerry's interest in things like internal, external control, and other kinds of issues like that. And my job really was to kind of oversee that, make sure they didn't go over their budgets, help them with regard to the development of their questionnaires and other kinds of things. And as I said, it was great working with Pat and Jerry in terms of trying to develop a kind of a group. Now, this was important for a whole bunch of different reasons. It was important to that the students actually come together as a group. Things weren't easy here in terms of issues of race and other kinds of things. Maybe we'll get into some of that at some other point. So as we went along, it became clear that there were two problems in the general literature that related to studies of African Americans. One was the poor methodology that had transpired up to that particular point, and that became clear from a lot of the research that we were trying to do. The second issue really related to the kind of lack of focus on what the students saw and what I saw as being the important questions to be asked. So the whole development of the National Survey of Black Americans really was all about trying to deal with those two twin particular kinds of problems. And so that's how that whole program got started.
And so what were the early conversations that took place? So you're working as a director for Jerry and Pat for a series of kind of smaller studies that are under a larger umbrella. And one day somebody throws out the idea for a larger survey, or how does that idea get introduced? Or does it come out of some other kind
No. A lot of this stuff was really organic. It was very difficult to, I think, in my own personal standpoint, to point to any particular given individual or person to say that was that person's idea or this was that person's idea. It was kind of an organic development out of this kind of soup that was developing at Michigan. And as a matter of fact, the first idea for the National Survey of Black Americans involved someone who wasn't even here. And I'm blocked on this fellow's name, who was early on. He was at another institution, and he was very interested in this issue. And there had been a lot of talks about the possibility of national surveys, and there's some studies that had been done, like the Marks study in 1964, which had a big oversample of blacks, and some of the issues about the 15 city studies, which came out of here, where again there was an oversample of blacks. So you had all this going on. Mm-hmm. But we were able to convince Bob Kahn. Bob Kahn was then the director of the Survey Research Center, to give us $25,000. And it was between Bob and Angus Campbell. Angus was then Angus was a very interesting figure in all of this. He and Bob were very supportive, and they actually gave us a small amount of money for travel and other kinds of things to try to pull this idea together. Mm-hmm. This other fellow, whose name I just getting old, but I can't remember, kind of dropped out of the picture after we did a kind of a preliminary proposal. And we wound up, based on that work, actually developing the proposal, which we submitted to NIMH for the big study. And
and what was the impetus for NIMH at that time?
Because NIMH had been very supportive of social and behavioral science research as it related to mental health. Again, we were also psychologists, mm-hmm. so that the mental health kind of focus was in some ways one that was very comfortable for psychologists. If we had been sociologists, or if I'd been in the sociology department or something, or political science, then the whole focus of the PR of the whole thing would have been different. It would have been a totally different focus. But this was a perspective that was very sympathetic. NIMH was sympathetic at that point in time. There was an African-American woman who was actually head of the division, for which we had lots of discussions about of getting the funding. The study itself was very unusual. We asked for a 2-year run-up to the study in order to accomplish the issues with regard to sampling, and 2 years to develop the questionnaire. It was very difficult. So then we put together a national group. This is where people like Sherman James came into play, and lots of others, of people across the country. We asked for money to bring them in. The questionnaire got divided up into about 10 different areas, and then there was a kind of a parallel development of various different areas of the study. We did 2 years of pre-testing, some of it very formal pre-testing and so on. We did a lot of things. I gave a talk recently on the Fisk lecture, the multi-method, multi-trait approach to how we understand testing, and the kind of approaches to cross-cultural studies were the two kind of undergirding perspectives that led to the development of the questionnaire and how we thought about doing the study. So we did a lot of interesting things in that study, like back translation procedures, and we did a lot of focus groups and so on.
And at that time, that wasn't really the convention necessarily, right?
No, in fact, the problem was there were a lot of unique things to the study. Now, the study came before the Program for Research on Black Americans. That's the reason why I'm talking about it in this particular sort of way. The National Survey of Black Americans grew out of this project with Pat and Jerry, with their particular support and the support of some key figures within the Institute for Social Research. Psychology didn't play much of a role in any of this because they were actually hostile to this particular set of movements, and we can talk about that if you'd like at some point. But they were fearful that having lots of blacks in the Department of Psychology would lower the standing of the department. In fact, they were absolutely convinced that that was the case. So there was a great deal of resistance in the department to that. The Institute was actually more open in general, although, as I'm going to tell you later on, they also were resistant in some ways too as well. So anyway, so we did all the pre-testing and we did everything else. The group, and again, students played a critical role in this area. In fact, had a lot to say about the selection of the topics, had a lot to say with regard to how we approach things and so on. Some of the mental health focus on this was because of Woody. I was hoping he'd be here today, because Woody at that point in time was actually working within the Community Mental Health Center and really argued, and Woody was very forceful. No, as a graduate student, these were very forceful graduate students. They were mature. They were, they had a certain kind of perspective. They weren't afraid to argue in that particular sort of way. I welcome that as coming out of the kind of Black Student Psychological Association background myself. I thought that was great. So I didn't try to put any brakes on that. I thought it was really important that we do this. So, some of the mental health focus actually became because of Woody. And Woody had become interested in what he called readiness for self-referral. At one point in time, I say, if I hear that word one more time, I'm going to kill him. Anyway, and which was a term that Jerry had used as part of a very important study that Jerry had done called Americans View Their Mental Health. And so a lot of what the National Survey of Black Americans was about was built on that particular perspective, which was actually a very, very good perspective, because although there are a lot of people who tell you that the notion of positive mental health was invented by people at Penn and other places 10 and 12 years ago, that's not true. The notion of positive mental health actually came out of the Americans View Their Mental Health, and it became part of what the Black psychology perspective was. And we had that view. So it wasn't just about disorders. It was about the notion of how do we understand what is positive mental health among an African American population that is discriminated against and has the kinds of circumstances that blacks had. So that's what we really kind of wanted to understand.
And this was the symptom checklist? Was that embedded in the early survey?
Yeah, the symptom checklist was, again, developed primarily by Woody and groups of students. And you got to remember, Phil and Belinda and one other person, I'm blocking her name. I'm sorry, she's under the weather. So Shirley Hatchett were the three study directors in this study. So I was the PI. They were the three study directors. By then, they had gotten their PhDs. Shirley hadn't, but the other two had. And we were doing this work. And then Jerry was our major advisor because Pat, by that time, had gotten interested in the Chicano movement. Some of that came out of the fact that she had adopted a young Chicano girl who's now an adult. And so she became interested in supporting the parallel study that was going on at the same time, which was the Chicano study. So these studies were in parallel. And we were working together, we partied together, we did a lot of things together back in the day. And in terms of these twin studies, so they were very, very important. In fact, these studies actually have walkovers, which have exactly the same items. It was a long time ago, so remember we did the studies in '79 and '80. It took us probably 5 years to get these studies in the field from when we first thought about it and got the proposal in and all the rest of it. So we're doing well there. Phil and Belinda and Shirley have different responsibilities for different things. Shirley was primarily responsible for the methodology. She and I worked very, very closely together on the development of it. Now, early on, a very important part of this really was the idea. So what was really radical at that point is that you could do a study on Black Americans.
Period.
It was radical. I know people have a really hard time understanding that. And the belief was that you really couldn't understand anything about Black Americans unless you put it into a race comparative framework. But that's not what the students or I was interested in or whatever. The argument was, well, we really want to know something about Black Americans. And if you look at the theoretical notions about the comparative approach in the social and behavioral sciences, there's no reason why you can't apply that approach to studying Black Americans. Because the issue was not, because in those days and for a long point, the research on race really was a comparative approach between blacks and whites. And starting from the perspectives in which they started was always the notion of the fact that whites were better. So the students argued, and I agree with this 100%, that we need to avoid that particular dynamic. We don't need that discussion. And we can avoid that by just focusing on blacks. Well, again, we were incredibly naive about this whole thing. In fact, the National Survey of Black Americans came out of, I used to sit around with Phil and Belinda and because we were kind of the senior people in this, and we'd laugh about how naive we were, about how these things would be accepted in what particular sort of way and so on.
If you can recall, like during that period of time when you guys are formulating this agenda item to do a national study of Black Americans, and you guys, as you say, are sitting back kind of laughing about how hard it is, do you remember some of the early responses, some of the early challenges that you came up against when you would pitch the idea to folks, and what were some of your early arguments to win over folks?
Well, what happened was, I told you now, the psychology department was out of it. The lots of people in the survey research, in ISR, not just survey research, because I was in the research center for group dynamics, were actually sympathetic. but they really didn't understand this. So one of the funniest things that happened, which was not particularly funny at that point, was the fact that the senior research faculty got wind of this project that we were working on, found out that the proposal was to do research on the African American population solely, without any comparative data on whites. And they called a special meeting of the senior research faculty at the Institute, all of them, up in 60-50.
Wow.
And they asked me to come and to explain to them why we were doing this and why we thought this was a legitimate, approach to social and behavioral science research. Because again, you have to remember the fears in those particular days was really somehow that, all these black people were going to bring down this outstanding institution and bring kind of disrespect and disrepute to this particular institution. That was the underlying basic fear that people had. And of course, anyway, so I got up and gave a talk on this. It wasn't fair to ask Belinda or Phil or any of the other young people to put themselves in a position. By that time, I was tenured. I was an associate professor. So I just got up and gave a talk and then answered any questions which they had. It was very difficult. So, at the end of the day, at whatever there was, an hour or whatever it took, they agreed with me and went away.
And so this is at a point, just to get the historical timeline, this is when you're getting ready to send the proposal to NIMH, or you'd already sent it? Or?
We already gotten the proposal because they
Okay.
really hadn't paid much attention to it.
Oh, okay.
Because you have to remember that nobody really thought that we would get it.
Right.
So, no, that's not unimportant
Yeah.
in this whole set of discussions. Of course, then we got it. Then we started having discussions about the sampling and other kinds of issues and so on. This is where all this came up. And then they heard about a sample of blacks.
Right.
Right. So the argument that we made, I think there were good arguments, and we had lots of discussions about that. It was a very democratic group. It wasn't very top down. Everybody could get their 2 cents in. I don't care whether you were a first-year graduate student or a 10th-year graduate student. I mean, you had a say in all of this kind of stuff. And the argument was that if you can bring data and arguments that make sense, then we'll do it that way. And so that's how all the whole questionnaires were formed, and various different elements of it. So anyway, so the twin parallel things are going on. So we're working on how do we get a national survey of black Americans based upon the distribution of the black population, because that was important when that had never been done before, because why would you do that? So the arguments that were made is that we should oversample blacks from those areas where blacks are in large numbers. And the idea is that if you oversample blacks, you get wound up with large numbers of blacks. So our argument was, yeah, but you wind up with large numbers of blacks who are really a lot alike. And in fact, if you look at the historical literature, it's one of the reasons why the data and the results are as what we see. So again, we used an empirical approach. And I argued that if we looked at some previous studies which had oversampled blacks, that indeed we would find unacceptable samples of those particular populations. And Bob Groves and I, at that point in time, actually did a study. It was never published, but we did a study where we looked at large numbers of these previous studies which had large numbers of blacks in it. And as it turns out, the sampling characteristics of those populations were all unacceptable. They were all unacceptable, and no one had ever done that before. So that's another thing that won over the sampling section, because they thought we were crazy too.
Right.
So then we had to solve the money problem. Finding blacks in a national survey, multi-stage, was very expensive. if you want to represent blacks, you had to represent blacks who both come out of dense households as well as non-dense households. Most of this work was done by Shirley and myself. Shirley was a superb methodologist, absolutely superb. She was a sociologist, student of Howard Schuman, as a matter of fact, just absolutely superb. So we argued this through. I came up with the idea for WASP, the Wide Areas Screening Procedure. I thought WASP was a cute name.
And tell us a little bit more about that screening procedure.
Yeah, WASP was important. Shirley actually came up with something called SLASP, which gets lost in the conversation. SLASP was how do you handle the problem when you got too many blacks, and WASP was a procedure for how do you handle it trying to find blacks when they're in low density areas. So the argument was that all blacks should be represented from all walks of life and from all regions, which was not true in the previous literature. So the idea was born out of the notion of the fact that we live in a racist society. And in this particular society, whites pay a lot of attention to where blacks are, particularly when they are in small numbers. Mm-hmm. So again, based upon the notion that we would demonstrate this effect, we developed this procedure. And by the way, the sampling people thought we were absolutely out of our mind. And the only reason we got this is because Amergatoy,
What was that?
Amergatoy, Amergatoy, thought this was interesting. Mm-hmm. And he was visiting here from, I think he was Irish, from Ireland. And today he's known as an outstanding researcher. He was the one who really pioneered in multiplicity sampling procedures. Anyway, so we got along great. And he said, you know, it's really kind of interesting. No one's done this before. So without his input, I think we'd have been in trouble because they were pretty standard. Bob Groves was a graduate student at that point in time. The guy who's head of APOR was a graduate student. I'm blocking on his name. Who's head of APOR, and they were working Bob Groves worked on the National Survey of Black Americans, and this other fellow, I'm going to block on his name, worked on the Chicano study, because the Chicano study had some of the same challenges. Rob Santos, right. So I just saw Rob, I should remember that. So Rob is now the president of APOR. As you know, Bob Groves was just a recent head of the census, and now is provost at Georgetown. And a renowned sample person, and so on. But these all were young people, I mean, at that point. So anyway, so we made an argument that we could create this procedure. And there was one other person who was really involved, a woman, sampler. Yeah.
Yes.
What was her name? Thank God Wayne is here, and he's a young fellow.
It'll come to me.
Irene Hess.
Yes, Irene, yes.
So Irene actually, and Irene was a little strange. So she didn't particularly care for me, but she liked Shirley. Okay. Yeah, she liked Shirley. So I would send Shirley down there to deal with them all the time because she really liked her. She just didn't care for me. Anyway, so I argued that we should do the study of this. So what we did was to use the Detroit Area Survey sampling knowledge. We took areas for which we knew how many blacks lived in those particular areas. And we had areas that range all the way from there, no blacks there, to areas for which there may be 20 to 30% black households in an average 60 household area. So trying out this WASP procedure. So WASP procedure was very simple. That you would select a household, and based on certain characteristics, for example, were there bicycles in the front yard, so there were families there and so on. So we had, all this was worked out. And then an interviewer, and white interviewers would do the WASP procedure because you were working primarily in largely white areas. And the idea was, how quickly could you locate all the black households within average 60 block areas without going and knocking on every door. Very, very simple procedure. Right. And so the procedure was built, though, on the notion that a high salient group like African Americans and highly identifiable and in a society for which prejudice and discrimination was very strong, that whites would know where the blacks were.
Right.
Right. And so as it turns out, they did know.
Right.
And in fact, what we found was that you could locate all blacks within a 60 household, on average, region by going to no more than 3 households.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So you didn't have to sample every household. The cost savings was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. So WASP was then applied to the national survey. And so there were about 20% of our block units turned out to be WASP units. And in about 20% of those units, we actually knocked on every door just to check whether the procedure worked or not. And what we discovered was that in the National Survey of Black Americans, we did not miss one black household.
Wow.
Which was absolutely amazing. SLASP, on the other hand, was a procedure to avoid overrepresenting blacks who lived in high-density areas. So we changed the way in which we did the sampling fractions based upon algorithms which we had developed. Again, Shirley led this approach, and that allowed us to get a better sample of blacks who lived in high-density areas. Because the problem is that if you take lots of blacks from areas in which there are high density, you don't get any demographic diversity within that particular sample. So that was, again, based upon the fact that poor people live together. So all this work kind of presaged Wilson's work and by the way, I was a consultant to Wilson's early work in Chicago. It somehow got forgotten, but anyway, so actually I worked with him in terms of that study early on, using a lot of the things we had learned in the National Survey of Black Americans.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that was prior to the Wilson work and his book in 1980. Yeah. It kind of interesting. Anyway, so it turns out that, so these things, it turned out they worked. We were able to generate the sample. All the post sample work showed it to be an outstanding sample, that we had done a great job. It had better characteristics than any national study on blacks up until that particular point, and we felt pretty confident about it. There were some mistakes made. We should have probably used a few more standard type of questions and items. Remember, we developed all the items pretty much from scratch.
Right.
You know, there are some standard things that are in it, but for the most part, each of the work groups, I think we had about 10 work groups that were working on the questionnaire. Each of those work groups were kind of charged with not taking things without empirical verification that these items and questions actually worked in black populations. That was the criteria.
What about, I think one of the other very intriguing things about the early National Survey of Black Americans was actually using a different field force.
Yeah, well, that didn't come about the way in which, that was not a positive decision. So a lot of people, again, a lot of these things are kind of lost. At that point in time, what we discovered was that ISR's survey operations were not competent to do research on an African American population that was distributed as Black Americans were distributed. So the difference between oversampling blacks in areas of high concentration as part of a national sampling frame and beginning which says this is the national sample frame of African Americans really meant that areas that came into your study as certainty areas and areas that came into as non-certainty areas were different than what the distribution of the white population were, because they had to be. So there's no national survey can be done on any population group if New York City is not included. You cannot represent the American population without representing people from New York. Same thing is true from blacks. But you can represent the American population without including Atlanta. Atlanta doesn't have to be included. But you can't do a study on the African American population without including Atlanta.
Right.
So if you want, it's a way in which you understand. So it turns out that a lot of our areas that were coming in with certainty were different than the areas that came in with certainty within the general population. So our staffing for the national survey, which is done once every 10 years in ISR, had no people in the areas for which we needed to be doing research. So we had to form our own. This is part of being absolutely out of your mind. So the idea, so we decided, we pulled together a national interviewing team. We'd supervise it. We do all those kinds of things. I mean, that was bizarre. We do all the training, so we would send, I forgot how many trainings we did, 10?
We did in excess of 10 trainings, but nationally there were more than 500 interviewers who were trained.
Right.
Not only in interviewing, but in field sampling.
And we lost so many people as to be totally unbelievable, because it was where we were asking people to interview. For example, Wayne knows about this because this is where he got shot at in Cabrini Green when we sent our national field force into Chicago. Well, we were selecting areas in Chicago because of the distribution of the black population that were actually avoided in most national surveys. I mean, who wants to go interview in Cabrini Green?
Right.
But we had no choice but to interview in Cabrini Green, because if we were going to represent the population properly, then those individuals within Chicago had to be represented in any sample of African Americans. So we were interviewing in some tough places. There were places in New Orleans. New Orleans was probably the worst place in the country at that time. They had the highest murder rate, robbery rate, and so on. And we had interviewers who were working in those areas. It was unbelievable. It was absolutely unbelievable.
So as hard as it is to train the interviewers, get the interviewers up to speed, collect the actual data, I'm sure there's a lot of stories about people getting shot at, for example. You also decide to do a 3-generation study at that point in time, and you also end up with I think it's 4-wave panel study, a short 4-wave panel study. At what point do you begin having those ideas, and how does that kind of play into the larger story?
Well, remember, the data collection was 79, 80. We ran into some problems with the national survey. Again, that probably takes a longer and larger treatment. Because we had to mount our own field study, we were using an imported way of staying on top of expenditures in the field, which proved to be inadequate. Not because of what we were doing, but because it was inadequate in general. And we actually went over budget with the National Survey of Black Americans. It's the only study that the Program for Research on Black Americans has ever gone over budget, ever, in the history of the program. I think we went over $600,000 over budget. And the primary reason was because the reports from the field with regard to expenditures and what was going on were actually late. They were not in real time. And we thought that they were in real time. So we were making decisions about how you move people to different places and how you do things, which was based on faulty data. The data were just faulty. And it was a real problem. But anyway, so we worked that out. I had always been interested in multi-generational research. I had done quite a bit of work in that. And to me, it seemed to be a natural thing to do. And again, because of the importance of the family and other things, that we could build onto that. I mean, that methodology is still some of the best methodological kinds of things that I've ever done. Shirley was interested in this too, and Shirley and I wrote quite a few papers at that particular point about how do you think about getting probability samples of family based upon probability samples in the cross-section. That was a real challenge, but we worked that out and we were able to develop that study. The panel study was a natural. One of the things that I've always regretted is that for a whole bunch of reasons this happened. They're going to be, and they're pretty controversial, but anyway, for a whole bunch of reasons they happened. We should have actually been kind of following in a longitudinal sort of way African Americans from the 80s up into the present. and we didn't do that. And like I said, there was a lot of reasons why we didn't do that. But the fact is that was always a problem. We were able to get funding to follow up the National Survey of Black Americans without refreshing the sample because we didn't really have enough money. And we were able to do the 3 additional waves, plus the work that we did on the Three Generation Study, which was a telephone survey follow-up to the family members that had been obtained.
Okay.
Right.
So as we transition to the next section here, if you can just think back to a few times that were really high points during this time, so I can imagine all the struggles that you had to go through in order to pull this thing off. But if there were any particular really exciting good points along the way that you can recall, if you could share those.
We had some good parties.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I've heard about parties.
Oh yeah, no, the parties were fantastic. Particularly the parties we had with the Chicano study, because we'd be dancing well up into the night. It's hard to believe,
Well, yeah.
With some parties with my grandmother would cook.
Right.
She
Oh,
was
wow.
great.
Okay.
Oh yeah. We had these parties that were
Wow.
fantastic, and she would cook chicken and dumplings and some real Southern cooking. That we'd have those over my house. That was a lot of fun. No, I think the high points were actually moving from what was a kind of a vague idea to kind of realize some of the things that the graduate students had really kind of pushed for, and me as well, and Belinda and others, to really realize that. You remember, the National Survey of Black Americans was to serve many different. There were many different rationales and many different ways in which it served in the general way in which we understand kind of the history of social science. And while we were doing this, I'm not sure we thought about that on a daily basis, but it turns out it broke down a lot of really strange kind of perspectives on how we think about research on blacks and how we think about how we do it. So we could develop replicable and valid methodologies for actually having an all-black sample that for which people really couldn't argue about. We could develop items and questions that could be demonstrated using standard techniques in the social and behavioral sciences for reliable and valid assessment within the particular populations that could be shown to be more sensitive and more valid than other kinds of approaches in which people had used. So these were all things for which there was empirical proof for this. And that was it turns out to be a very important thing to do. And finally, one of the things we don't talk a lot about, but was very important, is that the National Survey of Black Americans actually provided normative data on the African American population, which was not available up until that particular point. So if you're doing a little study in Detroit or somewhere else, and you're interested in self-esteem, now for the first time, you actually had normative data on the distribution of self-esteem in the black population or whatever subset you wanted because of the quality of this particular study. So I have always thought that that we, and this may be my fault and failing, is that we really have never actually capitalized on what the potential was in the National Survey of Black Americans and the research that we've done. Some of the reasons are structural, and some of the reasons are a little more complicated. But we should have been able to do a lot more with this whole thing than what we've been able to do.
Sure.
Yeah.
So actually, I just want to take a second to honestly talk a little bit about the parties, not in detail about what happened at the parties, but what role do you think having the more informal associations played in doing the high quality social science?
Well, one of the things that, and the reason why this was important at this particular point in time, for example, that's not important today. What I'm getting ready to say is not important today because things have changed a great deal. Back in the 1980s, 1970s, graduate students actually were a lot closer to faculty. Relationships were a lot closer than they are today. I mean, graduate students and faculty today don't really understand what this means when I say this. But it was a whole different era. And it was very important at that point. In some ways, graduate students were also more mature, in my estimation, than they are today. You had graduate students who looked more like Phil Bowman than they look like graduate students who are, 21 and coming into a graduate program.
Right.
It's a real difference between being 21 and coming in a graduate program and being 28, 29, 30 years old. Having children, being married, and that was more the kind of circumstance then. So it was very important to kind of break down barriers between kind of graduate students and faculty at that particular point, and to get to know people. So the social circumstances were very important for that.
So you think you talked a little bit earlier about the strong role that the graduate students played in the design of questions, et cetera, and so forth. And so do you think that this more informal relationship played a role in creating a sense of security among the graduate students to be so vocal and to participate in that aspect?
I do, because they got one of the things about the social thing is that people got to know people as people, and not as role incumbents, and that's I think that's one of the bad things about graduate education and training today, and when you only know people as kind of role incumbents. Then you get into situations where there's lack of trust, lack of understanding, all types of potentials for misunderstandings which take place between those kind of role incumbents, and that's one of the problems. I don't think I'm just waxing nostalgic about the old days, because the old days are always better than the new days. But the fact is that there has been a change, and that's one of the basic changes. So the social life was very important. I mean, in a way. It was very important in many different ways. I think that played a role in which people really kind of got to know each other. So they know where you're coming from, why you're doing this particular thing, and so on.
So one of the things that came up in another interview was that in addition to the house parties, there were also basketball teams. So it was basketball, what other kinds of social activities were involved in those days?
Well, I like those basketball teams. I got to be Dr. J. I still got my jersey someplace. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit nowadays, so I can't put it on. It said Dr. J across the back. I always tell a story about Phil, so, although Phil probably tells a different story. So we had a basketball team. We weren't great, but we won something. I never forget that Ron Brown was on that team. Phil was on that team. Were you on that team too?
I heard there was some kind of ringer too. There was a ringer guy. He was a really good player.
John Bacon.
Oh, John Bacon.
Yes.
Remember, God, John Bacon. Yeah. That brings back old days.
Yeah, he was a real baller, I'll tell you.
Yeah. But Phil had played in college at, I think, Northern Arizona.
Yeah.
Arizona. So Phil was absolutely convinced that we passed the ball into Phil. Phil would shoot. I used to crack up more. I said, "Don't pass that ball to that sucker anymore, because he's just gonna shoot." And sometimes he'd make it. So that was really funny. So, but I mean, it was
all those things. So there was a basketball team. There was there were house gatherings. Were there any other kind of informal?
Well, the advantages to all of that, I think, in addition to people really kind of getting to know each other and having kind of closer personal relationships, is that it actually, I think, in some ways improved the science. So there were always opportunity under informal kind of circumstances to think about, well, how do we assess that? Or, what did I learn for that? So oftentimes in these kind of informal settings, really good scientific conversations would just pop up, in terms of how we understood things and so on. And so that was always great,
Yeah.
But in some ways, like I said, I think it led to more trusting kind of circumstances and so on. Also, I think during that period of time, and I don't know how to put this exactly. And it's not to say that people weren't ambitious, because they were, but ambition was not necessarily the driving force among people. Today people are very ambitious, So it was less. There was a real sense of that people were involved in a kind of a joint project, really to try to understand something about the nature of the African American population and all of what that particular thing means. And this was a joint project. And that was a more important issue rather than individual kind of accomplishments and other kinds of things. And that was really important. That's changed a lot over time, And some of it has to do with regard to the change in the nature of the academy. So it's not just that people have changed and become more selfish and all that. I'm not saying that. But the academy has absolutely changed in terms of what's expected and so on. So today, the concern with regard to single authored papers and first author and blah, 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 was not a set of concerns that existed back in the formation of this particular program, because it wasn't important. And therefore, people could just work it out and get things done. Yeah. Now, it was important that that people, and particularly graduate students, had their particular areas of work, and it's one of the reasons why the program took the form that it did. And a lot of our products have turned out to be edited books and other kinds of things, because under those kinds of conditions, people can have some priority with regard to intellectual aspects of what they're doing in a way that wouldn't be there. For example, if I'd been writing all the books or whatever as non-edited books, that would not have showcased, the intellectual abilities of a lot of the students, particularly, that have been involved.
So I want to transition a little bit and talk a little bit about the genealogy that has resulted from the PRBA and the National Survey of Black Americans. I mean, when you look, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you look nationally, especially at elite institutions like Michigan, there seems to be something unique that happened. A lot of people that went to graduate school, in particular African Americans, who went to graduate school here in the late 70s and early 80s, were retained at the University of Michigan in one way or another, either on the faculty or as a research scientist, et cetera, and so forth. And you might have heard of this, but today people refer to the legacy of this expansive genealogy, all the contributions that came out of that, they call it the Michigan Mafia, right? And so what was the impetus? What was allowing, because today to keep someone on the faculty who got a PhD there is just not really done or looked upon as in a positive way. So what were some of the things going on there at that time that led to the ability to retain some folks?
Well, one of the things, so again, it was no accident that a lot of this came out of psychology. So the psychology department was actually built upon a model of internal development. And in fact, it only began to change in 1971 with my arrival and the arrival of Dick Nisbet. We arrived at exactly the same time. And Dick came in as an associate professor. I came in as an assistant professor in 1971. And up until that particular point in time, the department had actually done mainly internal hiring with regard to the faculty that were there. It was developed internally. So that's the reason why Pat Gurin was a PhD from Michigan, Jerry Gurin was a PhD from Michigan, Joe Veroff was a PhD from Michigan, Libby Devon was a PhD from Michigan. I could go on down the line of lots and lots of people who were PhDs from Michigan.
What was the philosophy, the argument for internal development at the time?
Well, I mean, it was pretty arrogant. So, the argument was that since we're training the best people in the country, why would we hire people from other places? Why would you do that? I mean, it was perfectly sensible. We also, ISR being here, also played a vital role in this particular kind of orientation. So remember, ISR was built upon an internal model development, because graduate students who this used to be just standard. You would enter ISR as a future potential faculty member by being a graduate student working on a project. And then graduate students would then be hired out of that particular position, incumbent position, to become study directors. And then over time, study directors would become program directors. So ISR was built under that particular model. That's the way it was built. But following 71, and Nisbet was a strong proponent of this because he was from the outside and became a very influential faculty member. And we moved more and more to a model which said we had to bring people in from the outside. And historically, the reason why was that you needed to represent other perspectives and other kinds of ideas rather than just reproducing your own kind of ideas and so on. I'm not so sure that's all that whether indeed that's all what it's cracked up to be, in my estimation. But that's what happened. And so that made a lot of changes. Now, we were able to take advantage of that particular perspective as we trained graduate students coming out of the PRBA. And we particularly had really good luck with public health. And the reason why we had good luck with public health was because PRBA perspective was a public health perspective. And a large part of that had to do with regard to Woody, but it also had to do with regard to other people too, who saw the problems and difficulties of the African American population from a public health perspective, not from necessarily an individual psychological perspective that need to be dealt with, but it's a larger public health issue. And public health at that point in time, and to today I still do, does a pretty good job of encompassing, not only a population perspective on things, but also a structural one. Although they don't talk about that very much, but that was true. And then a lot of the people who were involved at that point, who were coming along, particularly people like Sherman James, who quickly established himself as a very important, individual. He wasn't here then. I forget where Sherman was at, North Carolina, and was a part of our National Advisory Board. He kind of had that perspective. And a lot of other people on our National Advisory Board too as well, like Carl Bell and A.J. Franklin. All these people had a kind of a public health perspective. So, we were placing people at lots of places across the university. Social work, public health, psychology. I mean, so it worked out well. We didn't do as well in sociology or political science as well in those two places.
Yeah, a couple of political science people actually ended up winning state. So
yeah, like Brown and other people. And now we have his son who works with us here, which is really nice, so that was really great. So I think that was important. But we did indeed place people all across the country in a very good way. Belinda, whom we tried to get to stay, said, no, I'm going to California, and she had very good reasons why she wanted to go to California. So I wasn't going to, argue with her, although I did beg her. I got holes in my knees, don't leave, because she was really very, very good. Remember, Phil became an assistant professor in Afro and psychology. He had a joint appointment. I was very sorry that we lost him to UIC. That was a real loss for us. I still to this day think things would have been a lot different if Phil never would have left. It would have been a kind of a different model. That would have been great. But we had lots of other people.
So one of the questions that we're asking people is about their students. I'm a little scared to ask that question with the remaining time, but I thought that because I just know you've had
A couple.
a lot of students, and so that might be something we can collect in another medium. But I think, at least as a person who traces his own intellectual genealogy back to you through Phil and Tyrone, one of the things that's less obvious, that's less known, is who were your early teachers, who were your early mentors through graduate school and as a junior faculty member.
Well, you remember, I came through a kind of a different perspective. I mean, a lot of people don't know. My background was not in areas for which I'm kind of known today. My background really was in experimental social psychology. I was an experimental social psychologist. I ran rats when I worked with animal models in my master's thesis. I was very much interested in the brain and particularly cognition, and I was particularly interested in the effects of psychotropic medication on animal brains, particularly, like I said, rat models. So I did that kind of work, and then a lot of my work was in social psychology. I'm very much interested in the operant conditioning of social behavior, and so a lot of that work. My major mentors were people like Sam Comarita. Sam was a wonderful mentor for me. Sam wound up at Illinois and was well known for his experimental work. But more importantly, Sam was a survivor of the World War II incarceration of Japanese, and he and I actually had some very interesting conversations about how we understood that. He was very helpful to me. Reuben Barron was my major professor in graduate school. Reuben, that's Barron and Kinney. A lot of people know that work. So Reuben was my major professor, and he was great. Joe Schaefer, another guy I had at Toledo, was a mentor. He was a psychobiologist, and I learned a lot about my psychobiology at that particular point in time. When I came here, I think I would have to argue that Jerry probably has been one of my greatest influences in terms of how we think about things. He taught me survey research. I was not trained as a survey researcher, but Jerry was an outstanding survey researcher. And in fact, I don't think Jerry has actually gotten the kind of credit that he should have gotten, because his perspective on survey research was really something that became very compatible in how we understood the basic fundamental notion. If you say, what have you been doing in this work all these years? We would say that we have been trying to give voice to black people. We want to give voice to black people from all walks of life in all kinds of ways. Jerry believed that one of the problems if you were going to work with people, you have to be able to talk the language of people. So that Jerry taught me, when you write questionnaire items, you got to remember that you're not writing questions for your colleagues. You're actually writing questions for real people for whom the interviewer is going to interact with them. And by the way, we ran into a lot of trouble with that on the National Survey of Black Americans questionnaire. And some of my colleagues here actually said to me, your questionnaires aren't grammatically correct. And do you not know do you not know English grammar? And so my comeback to that, no, really, I mean, literally, people came to my office and said, this is a real problem. Again, you are not a good representation of what we are at the University of Michigan, because that's really what it was about. And I said, well, people don't talk like that. I said, you talk like that. You talk like that to your colleagues. But if you go talk to people who are going to be representative of African Americans, we need to write questions that are consistent with that particular language. That was a really big issue, by the way. It was hilarious. Don't you know English grammar?
Wow.
It was really hilarious. Yeah. Anyway, so these are the people who, and I think I was really influenced by Jerry. You know, although people joke and say Jerry taught you some people approach. So
some people approach.
Yes, the some people approach. Yeah,
Which
Wayne knows what I'm talking about. So Jerry used to write. Jerry used to write these items, and I used to tease him about it. So all the items start like the following. It's like, some people do X. Some people do Y. Some people do Z. What do you do? So the notion is that you were putting them into a framework which said there are a lot of different things that people can do.
All okay.
They're all okay. And so that's, if you look at the National Survey of Black Americans, you'll see that really is a kind of a framework which we developed. And again, it was really kind of interesting. So Jerry was important. Pat was important. Pat was a force. Pat and Jerry are so different as to be. I sometimes I wonder how they got married. But Jerry's always kind of laid back, and the some people approach. Pat is, straight ahead and all the rest of that stuff. But she was very important with the formation of the National Black Election Studies, which was another part of the history of PRBA that we haven't talked much about. That part of the history comes out of, again, my own personal biography, which, there's not a lot of time for it. But I was affected a lot by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Jesse Jack. I knew all these people. So they were very important kinds of role models and interesting people for me. To this day, I'll never forget the day I met Malcolm X and got a chance to talk to him was the day that he gave a very famous speech at Michigan State where he said, it was really funny. I mean, it was funny. I mean, you had to laugh. I was an undergraduate student. He said, you know what we call black professors? Audience, niggas. And his point was, he was a really smart guy. He says, look, you need to understand that we're all in this together.
Right.
There's nothing special about you because you get to get a PhD and you get to sit out there and so on. And it was really, really funny. It was a call to arms at that point in time of people who were hiding in the academy, when, brothers and sisters were getting killed in the South. It was really, really interesting. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that interaction. So so all those people, historically have been important to me. Although the most dynamic person I ever met was probably the leader of the Teamsters, the one who was murdered, Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was the most dynamic person I've ever met. That includes Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and a whole bunch of other people that I knew. So a lot of my background and my biography is really located within the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement of Detroit. It's lodged within my understanding of the kind of Malcolm X approach. It's lodged within what was going on with regard to the 60s, the Vietnam War. Those kinds of things are things which, all contribute to producing, an academic who arrived at Michigan in 1971 with a slightly different perspective. It was also important that I came out of a poor background too, so that's not unimportant in terms of how we understand that.
So in the last few moments that we have, so you say that you were interested in engineering, you went into experimental work, you were running, rat models, mouse models, even The Rat Was White. It was a great book, even when I was in undergrad. And you come to Michigan and you're surrounded by these black graduates. Well, by that time you had been a member of the Black Psychology Students Association and also then a member of the Black Psychology Association. You come to Michigan and you begin doing this work on black people, focusing on black people and the various social, structural, and psychological phenomenon that are going on there. You innovate methodologically, etc., and you develop your own research program. And so, if you could say a little bit about some of the primary contributions that you've made to social science over these years, drawing upon stuff from the National Survey of Black Americans, but also any other kind of major frameworks that you've offered or findings that you've offered that you're particularly proud of.
Well, I have a different perspective on this. I never felt that I owned the Program for Research on Black Americans because it was not an ownership issue. My job was as a facilitator. And I became interested in, because of my background in community psychology, what really interested me about what we were doing in the Program for Research on Black Americans was really giving voice to black people. And it was one of the ways in which I could work to give a contribution to the circumstances and plights that African American people had found themselves in, for very good reasons. So I never saw it as my research program as something that I really owned. It was a cooperative venture with people who were smarter and better than me. I mean, I never doubted that Phil was smarter than I am, by leaps and bounds, or Belinda, or all these people. They were really smart. I wasn't as smart as they were. And so it was easy to work with all these people who had ideas, and my job was to really to give them resources, and to give them voice, and to give them opportunities, to develop. And I think the proof's in the pudding. 40 years later, we can look around the country and we see people now being produced by people who were kind of the offspring of that program. You mentioned this before. Tyrone was a wonderful, graduate student in this program, and he was so sharp. I mean, I learned so many things from him. But Phil, another one, that you had contact with, and all these people out there now who are producing other
all
people.
All over the place.
And that was the whole idea. Yeah. So we wanted to do that. My own research has only come into focus, probably in the last 5 to 10 years. And so, because you asked me that question.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited about the work that I'm doing now on SNOD, which is.
If you could
right.
tell us what that is.
Oh, it's
social
neuroscience of health disparities. So we became interested in the health disparity stuff a long time ago. But I'm really interested in underlying mechanisms and models. So this actually goes back to my work, as a graduate student, and at Toledo, and also at Wayne State, where I was really focused in on understanding mechanisms and how they operate. I've always been less interested in description. A lot of social science research is kind of rooted in describing differences or other kinds of things. I found that pretty boring. My own interest is, what are the kind of underlying mechanisms and how do we understand it? So this is what I'm very, very excited about. So this more recent work is very exciting to me. So I'm doing some really interesting things at this point. That's not to say that the work that I've done, for NPRBA and the things that have been published and other kinds of things, are not important to me, because they are. But mainly coming out of my notion that part of the responsibilities of a black academic is really to try to contribute to furthering the community of African Americans. And our work, I think, has been vital in the PRBA through, I ran into Congressman Conyers the other day. Congressman Conyers was very important to us back in the 1980s in giving us a forum with the Congress about what the findings were out of the National Survey of Black Americans. And I testified before his committees and other kinds of things on a lot of different times about how we do things. Well, these are important things. They help shape legislation and other kinds of stuff. And the program has had incredible effects on those things. So I think that's all wonderful. I mean, that's what I like to do. But for my own personal research, if you ask me, well, what gets your motor running as a scientist, it's then trying to uncover, mechanisms that account for basic kinds of behaviors that we see.
So why don't you tell us in just a couple of minutes here, a little bit about people sort of talk about it around the office as the bad behaviors thesis for these mental and physical health disparities between blacks and whites. If you could just give us a short description of the perspective.
Well, I always said that, I've always said this, and I think it's true. A lot of very good social science comes out of irritation. So, I was irritated by some things for a long time. One of the irritations that I had is that the ways in which we accept the things that produce disparate outcomes between population groups. And the underlying model which accounts for why Black Americans have the statuses they do, whether health status or financial status and so on, are all about a deficit model. I don't care how you cut it or whose deficit model you use, whatever it may be, there's something about individuals who are in this population that they have certain deficits which don't allow them to be able to achieve what other people in other populations do. I don't care what it is. Now you can talk about the people have played that out and they have different theoretical frameworks for it and so on, but that's the fundamental model. So if that's true, then we can understand why the health of the African American population is worse than the health of the white population. And it's true. African Americans die on average 6 to 8 years faster than whites do. African Americans suffer from more diabetes and obesity, and we can run down the line. And all of that could be due to the fact that African Americans live in worse circumstances, they have situations and so on. But why do they have better mental health? Why are the rates of major depression and anxiety disorder and so on lower among whites? So if you're going to try to account for why we see these health deficits because of the deficits in living conditions and so on, why do they produce things which are diametrically opposed? So this is irritating. So that's where the research comes from. Mm-hmm. So the idea was to try to find a way in which we understand a model or underlying set of mechanisms that could produce these particular outcomes that we observe. Mm-hmm. And that's where the work has been. And now we think that we have. Okay. So now we think we can control the effect. Go ahead, sorry.
But what do you think is the main cause for this discontinuity between physical health and mental health for
African Americans buy their better rates of mental health by selling out their physical health, and they do this in a way, some conscious or non-conscious and so on. So the big culprit that I've been interested in is stress, and particularly chronic stress, and chronic stress is what produces these particular outcomes. Chronic stress creates distress in people. Chronic stress produces noxious stimuli, and people are agenic, and given these circumstances, will engage in behaviors to remove the noxious stimuli. And it turns out that a very easy way to do this is to engage in a set of behaviors that we call bad behaviors. So smoking, drinking, drug abuse, eating comfort foods are all ways in which you shut down the stress response network, which removes the noxious stimulus. So what that does is two things. One, it contributes to your bad health outcomes, physical health. And secondly, it protects you against the cascade to mental disorders, and that is the stress-related ones, anxiety disorders and major depression. So we make this argument, and we think we have that mechanism pretty well tied down, and we think that, well, it's led me to another whole different way. In fact, it's led me now to become interested in race, which I'd never been interested in before.
So I just want to ask that question, right? So what's your next big question?
Race.
Just race.
No, I've become very much interested in what I call the what I call the racialization of the population. So what I'm really arguing at this point in time, and this is all brand new, is that black people who are born with the category of black are not the same people who die with the category of black. And our misunderstandings with regard to how we think about race has led us to believe that. And we think it's because of genetic reasons, or we think it's other kind of reasons, and so on. It's a strong environmental theory, and the argument is that anybody in this particular society where to be black is to be in a lower and more problematic category. Anybody could be racialized to be black. It doesn't matter what you're born. And the reason why we observe the kind of outcomes we so easily observe between blacks and whites is because a larger proportion of people who are initially categorized as black face a set of circumstances as they traverse their individual life courses that expose them to circumstances and situations which result in bad outcomes. And if we would expose anybody to those kind of circumstances, they would have bad outcomes.